In the spring of 1932, in the Atlas district of Stockholm, Sweden, a crime unfolded that would leave investigators stunned, journalists scrambling for headlines, and citizens whispering in fear. It was a crime so bizarre, so unsettling in its details, that it would later be remembered not by the name of the victim, but by the name given to her unknown killer, the Atlas vampire. Before you drift off, do me a small favor and tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Stockholm in the early 1930s was a city still bearing the marks of the First World War and the global depression that followed. The streets carried both elegance and hardship, with trams rattling past tall stone apartment blocks, their windows glowing warmly in the evening, while workers trudged home in worn coats against the chill of the northern air. It was a city that mixed modern progress with the shadows of poverty. Beneath its polished surface, an undercurrent of desperation and survival ran strong, particularly in districts where those on society's margins lived and worked. One of those districts was Atlas, named after the Atlas Copco industrial works that had once dominated the area. It was a working-class neighborhood, full of narrow streets and modest apartments, where residents lived close to one another and news traveled quickly from door to door. In 1932, many of its inhabitants struggled to make ends meet, and among them were women who sold sex to survive, working quietly from their apartments or in darkened corners of the city. On the morning of May 4th, 1932, concern spread when a sex worker named Lily Lindström had not been seen by her neighbors for several days. Lily was 32 years old, living alone in a small, tidy apartment at Brunnsgatan 7 in the Atlas area. She was known by her friends and neighbors as polite, private, and careful. She supported herself through sex work, occasionally entertaining clients in her apartment, and those who knew her described her as cautious about who she allowed inside. Yet in early May, she had vanished from view. Her neighbors, who sometimes saw her through the window or spoke with her in passing, began to notice her absence. When police were called to check on her, they found the door to her apartment locked from the inside. Breaking it open, they stepped into a scene that froze them in their tracks. Lily was dead. Her body lay face down on her bed, completely naked. Her clothes were neatly folded on a chair beside the bed, as though she had removed them with care before meeting whoever had come to her door. The crime scene was horrific. Lily had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object, her skull bearing the marks of brutal blows. She had also been sexually assaulted, though investigators could not determine whether this occurred before or after death. Most disturbing of all, when police examined the body and the room more closely, they found evidence that Lily's blood had been drained. A used condom was left near the bed, and beside it an ordinary soup ladle. Both were stained with blood. It appeared that the killer had not only murdered Lily, but had collected and possibly consumed her blood. The brutality of the crime, combined with the eerie suggestion of vampirism, spread quickly through the city. Newspapers seized on the story, dubbing the unknown killer the Atlas vampire. The details were sensational, and in a time when fear and curiosity sold papers, the murder of a sex worker in such grotesque circumstances captured public attention. The investigation began immediately, but from the start, police were confounded. There was no sign of forced entry. The door had been locked from the inside, suggesting that Lily had either willingly let her killer in, or that the killer had possessed a key. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual, no screams, no struggle. Whoever had killed Lily had done so quietly, efficiently, and left the apartment as though vanishing into thin air. Detectives began questioning Lily's acquaintances and clients. She was known to keep a small circle of regular visitors, men who paid her for companionship and sex. Each was interrogated, their alibis checked. Some admitted to visiting her in the past, but none confessed to being there on the night of her death. The used condom, which in another age might have provided crucial DNA evidence, was useless in 1932. Forensics was still in its infancy, and the most investigators could determine was that it had indeed been used by a man. Attention also focused on the soup ladle found at the scene. Why would it have been used? Was it truly evidence that the killer had drunk Lily's blood, or had it been placed there deliberately to create such an impression? The newspapers took the first interpretation, publishing lurid stories about a vampire haunting Stockholm, a predator who drank the blood of his victims. Fear spread quickly through the Atlas neighborhood, where women whispered about the possibility of a man who might strike again, choosing his victims from among those most vulnerable. But despite weeks of investigation, no clear suspect emerged. The police interviewed dozens of men, but none could be tied to the crime. Some were eliminated because they had strong alibis, others because they simply did not fit the timeline. No one could explain how the killer had left the apartment locked from the inside. No one could explain why Lily, usually cautious, would have let someone in without suspicion. The case grew colder with each passing week. The newspapers, which had once splashed the story across front pages, moved on to other scandals and events. For the residents of Atlas, the fear lingered, but without new crimes, the panic gradually faded. Life returned to its rhythms, though the name of the Atlas vampire remained a whisper, a reminder of what had happened in May of 1932. Over the decades, criminologists, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts have returned to the case, trying to solve what the police could not. Some argue that the vampiric element was exaggerated by the press, that the ladle and the blood were misinterpreted, and that the killer was simply a violent client who panicked after the murder. Others insist that the draining of blood was too deliberate to be accidental, suggesting a ritualistic or fetishistic motive. Theories about the locked apartment also abound. One possibility is that the killer had taken Lily's keys and locked the door behind him before discarding them elsewhere. Another is that Lily herself had locked the door upon letting him in, a habit of caution that tragically did not save her. Without modern forensic tools, these details remain speculative, shadows in a case long since faded. The murder of Lily Lindström is remembered less for the woman herself than for the figure of her nameless killer. The press stripped her of identity and gave her death a legend. She became the victim of the Atlas vampire, her humanity eclipsed by the grotesque fascination with how she was killed. Yet behind the headlines was a woman who had lived, worked, and tried to survive in a difficult world. Her story, like that of so many women who fall victim to violence, was reduced to a sensational nickname. Today, almost a century later, the case remains unsolved. The apartment building still stands in Stockholm, its walls having absorbed the silence of the decades. Passers-by may not know what took place there in 1932, but those who remember the story still speak of the Atlas vampire, the killer who drained his victim's blood and vanished without a trace. The mystery endures because it is both specific and universal. Specific in its bizarre details, the ladle, the blood, the locked door. Universal in its reminder that some crimes are never solved, some killers never named, and some victims never truly remembered beyond the shadows cast by their deaths. As night falls over Stockholm, one can imagine the city in 1932, the trams rattling past, the lamps flickering to life in apartment windows, the air heavy with early spring. In one small apartment, a woman met her end in silence, her life extinguished by a figure who slipped back into the darkness. Whether he was a fetishist, a sadist, or something stranger still, no one ever knew. He left behind only the legend of a vampire and the memory of a life stolen too soon. And so, the Atlas vampire remains one of Sweden's most haunting mysteries, a case that even now resists explanation, inviting speculation but never yielding truth. Second story, Hinterkaifeck murders, 1922, Bavaria, Germany. In the spring of 1922, on an isolated farmstead in rural Bavaria, Germany, a family of 6 was murdered in one of the strangest and most unsettling crimes Europe has ever known. The killings at Hinterkaifeck farm remain unsolved to this day, more than a century later, and the details still send shivers through those who hear them. It was not just the brutality of the murders, but the mystery that surrounded them, the strange footprints, the unexplained noises, the feeling that someone had been watching the family for weeks before the crime. The case remains frozen in time, a riddle without an answer, remembered as the Hinterkaifeck murders. The Hinterkaifeck farm lay about a kilometre from the small town of Groben, deep in Bavaria's forests and fields. The farmstead was modest but self-sufficient, a large wooden farmhouse with an attached barn and stables, surrounded by land for crops and animals. Its owners, the Gruber family, lived there mostly cut off from their neighbours, as many rural families did in the early 20th century. But unlike other farms, Hinterkaifeck carried an air of unease long before the murders. Strange things had been happening there, and those who lived within its walls often spoke of a creeping sense that something was not right. The family consisted of Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, 72 years old, his wife Cecilia, 70, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, 35, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Also living with them was the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived at the farm only hours before she met her end. Andreas Gruber was known in the area as a difficult and harsh man. Rumours swirled about his violent temper and his troubled relationship with his daughter Victoria. Court records confirmed that Andreas and Victoria had been charged years earlier with incest, a dark stain on the family's reputation. Victoria's son, Joseph, was widely believed by neighbours to be the result of that relationship, though others whispered that he might be the child of a local man, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. In either case, the family was considered odd, secretive, and burdened with scandal. In March of 1922, weeks before the murders, Andreas Gruber noticed strange footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the house. They were not the family's own, and led directly to the farmhouse, but curiously, none led away. Around the same time, keys went missing, and the family began hearing unexplained noises in the attic. Andreas told neighbours that he believed someone might be living up there, watching them. The family even reported seeing a newspaper in the house that none of them had purchased, as though someone else had carried it in. Despite these disturbing signs, Andreas refused to call the police. He was proud, stubborn, and disliked involving outsiders in his affairs. The family stayed put, even as the unease grew. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, darkness fell over Hinterkaifeck. The details of what happened next are reconstructed only from the evidence left behind. Sometime during that night, the killer or killers struck. One by one, members of the household were lured into the barn. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria, and his granddaughter Cecilia were each attacked there, beaten to death with a mattock, a type of farm tool similar to a pickaxe. Forensic examination suggested that Victoria fought hardest. Her body bore signs of a desperate struggle. The youngest 7-year-old Cecilia appeared to have survived her initial injuries long enough to pull out her own hair in agony before succumbing. After the 4 family members in the barn were killed, the killer moved into the house. Inside, he murdered little Joseph in his crib, striking the toddler with the same brutal weapon. The last to die was Maria, the maid who had only just arrived that day to begin her service with the family. She was killed in her bed, still dressed in her travel clothes. The scene inside the farmhouse was gruesome, but what made the murders so unsettling was what happened afterward. The killer did not flee immediately. Evidence suggested that the murderer stayed in the house for days. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney in the days after the murders, and the family's cattle had been fed. Bread and meat were taken from the kitchen, and someone had slept in the beds. The idea that the murderer lived among the corpses of the family, carrying on their daily tasks, horrified investigators and neighbors alike. The bodies were not discovered until April 4th, when neighbors concerned that no one from the farm had been seen in days went to check. They found the doors locked and the animals restless. Entering the barn, they stumbled upon the stacked, partially covered bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia. Shocked, they alerted authorities, who soon uncovered the remaining 2 victims inside. Word of the murders spread quickly through Groben and the surrounding villages, throwing the community into panic. Investigators arrived from Munich, but the crime scene was immediately compromised. Dozens of townspeople flocked to the farm, walking through the house, touching the bodies, disturbing evidence. In a time before modern forensic standards, crucial details were lost in the chaos. The murder weapon, the mattock, was not found until months later, hidden in the barn. Theories about the killer began almost immediately. Suspicion fell first on Lorenz Schlissenbauer, the neighbor who was rumored to be Joseph's real father. Lorenz was among the first to discover the bodies, and witnesses said he acted strangely at the scene, unlocking doors and handling the corpses with little hesitation. Some believed he had a motive, either anger over custody disputes with Victoria or resentment toward Andreas. Yet no definitive evidence tied him to the crime, and he was never charged. Other theories suggested that the murders were committed by a vagrant or a robber, but this made little sense. Money and valuables were left untouched in the house, suggesting that theft was not the motive. The brutality of the killings, combined with the killer's decision to remain in the house, suggested something far more personal and disturbing. Some investigators believed the family's dark reputation played a role. Andreas Gruber was widely disliked, and his abusive behavior may have earned him enemies. Victoria, meanwhile, was active in the church choir and had close ties to her community, making her murder especially shocking. The incest scandal, combined with the possibility of paternity disputes, created layers of resentment that could have motivated someone close to them. In later years, modern researchers revisited the case, examining the evidence with new eyes. Some suggested that the killer might have been a farmhand or worker who knew the family's routines. Others argued that the attic noises and footprints indicated that the killer had been living on the property for days or even weeks before the murders, watching and waiting for the right moment. This theory is supported by the missing keys and unexplained newspaper, which suggest the presence of an intruder who moved silently through the farmhouse. Despite countless theories, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved. Over the years, everyone from neighbors to soldiers to complete strangers has been suggested as the culprit, but no conclusive evidence has ever been found. The case remains one of Germany's most famous unsolved mysteries, a story retold in books, documentaries, and whispered conversations. The farm itself was demolished in 1923, just a year after the murders, but the land where it once stood still carries the weight of its history. Visitors to the site have reported a strange stillness, a silence heavy with memory. The surrounding forest, dense and dark, seems to press close around the clearing, as if guarding the secrets of what happened there. The Hinterkaifeck murders endure not only because they were brutal, but because they leave us with a sense of intrusion. The killer did not simply take lives. They invaded the sanctity of a home, turned it into a tomb, and then lived among the dead as if mocking the boundary between life and death. That unsettling detail, the smoke in the chimney, the fed cattle, the made beds, is what makes Hinterkaifeck so haunting even now. As night falls over Bavaria, one can imagine the farmstead as it was in 1922. The wooden walls creaking in the wind, the snow-covered fields stretching silent into the distance, the faint glow of lanterns flickering through windows. Inside, the Gruber family lived their final hours unaware that death was already near, that someone was watching from the attic, waiting for the moment to strike. The murders at Hinterkaifeck remain a puzzle that refuses to be solved. They remind us that sometimes evil does not arrive with warning or reason. Sometimes it slips silently into our homes, leaves horror behind, and vanishes back into the shadows, carrying the truth away forever. And so the story endures, passed down through generations, told in hushed voices and late-night retellings. Hinterkaifeck is more than a crime scene. It is a symbol of the unknowable, the reminder that not every story has an ending, not every question has an answer. 1. The Watcher House, 2014, Westfield, New Jersey, USA. In the summer of 2014, on a tree-lined street in Westfield, New Jersey, a family thought they had found their dream home. The house was large, elegant, and full of the character that comes with more than a century of standing in one of the state's most desirable suburbs. Its white facade rose behind neatly trimmed hedges. Its porch stretched wide across the front, and tall windows looked out over 657 Boulevard, one of the town's most recognizable addresses. For Derek and Maria Broadus, who had saved and planned for years, this house was more than just a property. It was the promise of a future. It was the place where they imagined their 3 children growing up, playing in the yard, walking to school, and filling the rooms with laughter. Before you drift off, do me a small favor and tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Westfield was known for its quiet affluence. The town had historic roots, with streets shaded by mature trees, shops that had stood for decades, and neighbors who took pride in their community. It was close enough to Manhattan for commuting, but far enough away to offer a sense of calm. Families sought out Westfield precisely because it seemed safe, respectable, and shielded from the chaos of larger cities. For generations, it had been the kind of place where people locked their doors more out of habit than necessity. The house at 657 Boulevard had been built in 1905, and its architecture spoke of that era. It was a grand 6-bedroom colonial, with a broad staircase, high ceilings and woodwork that reflected the craftsmanship of another time. It carried with it a sense of permanence, as if it had witnessed the lives of many families who had come and gone, each adding their own layer to its history. For Maria, who had grown up in Westfield just a few blocks away, the house was familiar. It was the kind of home she had admired as a child, one of the stately residences that seemed to represent achievement and stability. For Derek, who had risen from a working-class background in Maine to a successful career in insurance, the house was a symbol of how far he had come. Together they imagined that 657 Boulevard would be their family's forever home. They closed on the property in June, full of plans for renovations before moving in. The house was old and needed some updating, but that only added to its charm. They wanted to preserve its historic beauty while making it comfortable for their children. Contractors were called, schedules were drawn, and the excitement of preparing the house for move-in filled their days. In those first weeks, the family visited often, walking through the empty rooms, talking about where furniture would go, and letting the children explore the garden. Then, without warning, the dream shifted into something darker. A few days after the purchase, the first letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, addressed not by name but simply to the new owner. Inside, written in thick, uneven handwriting, was a message that unsettled Derek immediately. It welcomed them to 657 Boulevard, but not in the cheerful tone of a neighbor introducing themselves. The writer claimed to be watching the house, to have been watching it for years, and to be waiting for the family to move in. The words were not overtly violent, but there was an undercurrent of menace that could not be ignored. At first, Derek wondered if it was a prank. Westfield was an affluent but quiet town, and sometimes teenagers played jokes. But the letter contained details that made it impossible to dismiss so easily. The writer seemed to know things about the family and about the house. They asked unsettling questions about who would be sleeping in which bedrooms, and referred to the children as young blood. They mentioned watching from afar and waiting for the family to arrive. In the days that followed, more letters arrived. Each one was stranger, more disturbing than the last. The writer called themselves the Watcher, and claimed that their family had been responsible for observing 657 Boulevard for generations. They said their grandfather had watched the house in the 1920s, their father in the 1960s, and now it was their turn. They described themselves as the house's caretaker, someone chosen to observe it, to ensure that it remained under their watchful eye. The tone of the letters shifted between cold curiosity and veiled threat. The Watcher asked if the new owners had discovered what lay within the walls of the house. They commented on renovations, noting changes as if they were monitoring the work closely. They referred again to the children, asking about their names, their habits, and their plans. "Once I know their names, I will draw them out." One letter read, a line that chilled Derek and Maria. The sense of intrusion grew unbearable. The family had not even moved in yet, and already they felt as though they were being stalked. They began to notice every passerby on the street, every car idling too long at the curb. Neighbors who had once seemed friendly suddenly felt suspicious. The Watcher's letters contained small details that suggested someone nearby was writing them, someone close enough to see, someone with enough time to observe. The Broadduses went to the police, who opened an investigation. The letters were examined for fingerprints, but none were found. DNA analysis revealed traces of female DNA on one envelope, but it matched no one in the local database. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing residents, asking if anyone had seen suspicious behavior, but Westfield was a quiet place, and no one offered useful information. As the letters continued, the family's fear deepened. They stopped bringing their children to the house. Worried that someone was watching, they hired private investigators, consulted former FBI agents, and even brought in forensic linguists to analyze the writing. Experts suggested that the author might be older, perhaps fixated on tradition, given the references to past generations. The style of the letters suggested obsession, but also calculation. Whoever the Watcher was, they were careful enough to avoid detection. The suspects multiplied in the family's mind. Some neighbors had lived on the street for decades. Perhaps one of them resented the newcomers, or felt possessive of the house. Others speculated that it could be someone who had lost out on the purchase, angry at being denied the property. Still others whispered that it might be a former resident, someone unable to let go of their connection to 657 Boulevard. Each theory seemed plausible, but none brought answers. Meanwhile, the family's life unraveled. They could not move into the house, yet they were financially bound to it. They tried to sell, But once the story of the letters spread, potential buyers backed away. Who would want to live under the gaze of a stalker who might never stop writing? They sued the previous owners, claiming that they had also received letters but failed to disclose them. The case went to court, but no wrongdoing was proven. The years dragged on, and the house at 657 Boulevard remained a symbol of menace. The Broaduses rented it out briefly, but even tenants received letters. The Watcher continued to write, though less frequently, reminding everyone that they were still there, still watching. The mystery drew national attention. Journalists wrote about it, and soon the story appeared in magazines, newspapers, and eventually on television. The idea of the Watcher fascinated and disturbed people. It was not just the act of sending letters. It was the intimacy of them, the way they targeted the children, the way they suggested an almost supernatural guardianship of the house. It was the fear of being watched without knowing by whom. In 2019, after years of struggle, the Broaduses finally sold the house at a loss. They never lived in it. They never uncovered who the Watcher was. They left Westfield behind, carrying with them the psychological scars of years spent under surveillance by an unknown figure. The case remains unsolved. Theories still circulate. Some insist it was a jealous neighbor, someone with too much time and too much anger. Others think it was a hoax, though no evidence supports that theory, and the family gained nothing from the ordeal. A few believe the Watcher may still live in Westfield, still watching 657 Boulevard, waiting for another family to move in. What makes the Watcher case so haunting is its subtlety. No one was killed. No one was attacked, yet the fear was overwhelming because it was rooted in the invasion of privacy. The knowledge that someone knew intimate details, that someone was obsessed enough to write, to watch, to linger. It was a reminder that terror does not always come with violence. Sometimes it comes with words, written on paper, slid into your mailbox, waiting quietly for you to read them. The house itself still stands. To anyone passing by, it looks like any other grand home in Westfield: white walls, tall windows, a manicured yard. But those who know its history see something different. They see a stage on which an invisible figure once performed, a place where fear was delivered by mail. They see a symbol of how easily safety can be shattered, even in the most idyllic of towns. Tonight, as you think of 657 Boulevard, imagine the street at dusk. The lawns are quiet, the street lamps flicker on, and curtains draw shut across wide windows. Imagine the mailbox at the end of the drive, an ordinary metal box holding an envelope addressed to no one in particular, yet meant for you. Imagine unfolding the letter inside, the handwriting sprawling across the page, the words telling you that someone has been watching longer than you can imagine. Imagine the silence that follows, as you glance at every window, every shadow, every neighbor, and wonder who among them is the Watcher. The mystery endures, because it was never solved. The Broadus family moved on, the house was sold, and life in Westfield returned to normal. But for anyone who hears the story, the house at 657 Boulevard will never again be just a house. It will always be the Watcher house. To the Circleville Letters, 1976-1994, Ohio, USA. In the summer of 1976, the small town of Circleville, Ohio, found itself at the center of a mystery that would linger for nearly 2 decades. Circleville was a quiet place, surrounded by farmland and intersected by long, flat roads that led toward Columbus. It was the kind of town where people knew one another by name, where gossip traveled faster than official news, and where appearances mattered. In Circleville, reputations were currency, and secrets had a way of festering in silence. But that summer, silence ended. The town began to receive letters, dozens, then hundreds of them, each one written in the same blocky, angry handwriting, each one exposing secrets, spreading fear, and leaving behind a sense that someone somewhere was always watching. The first letters were received by a woman named Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver who lived with her husband Ron and their children. Mary was respected in the community, known for her reliability and steady presence in town life. But in the summer of 1976, she opened an envelope that would change everything. Inside, the letter accused her of having an affair with Gordon Massey, the superintendent of schools. The writer demanded that the relationship stop, claiming that if it continued, the whole town would know. The handwriting was distinctive, blocky and uneven, almost childlike, but with an unsettling intensity. At first, Mary kept the letter to herself, but more arrived. They carried the same message, the same insistence, the same sharp edge of menace. The writer seemed to know details about Mary's life, her family, and her movements. Soon Ron began receiving letters too, accusing him of ignoring his wife's supposed indiscretions, warning him that if he did not act, he would pay the price. The Gillespies felt trapped, caught in a net of accusations and threats that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. As the weeks passed, the circle of recipients widened. Other residents of Circleville began to find the same envelopes in their mailboxes, each containing accusations of corruption, affairs, or misconduct. The letters were not confined to one family or one rumor. They seemed designed to expose, to destabilize, to frighten. Some accused local officials of corruption. Others hinted at dark secrets in seemingly ordinary households. All were written in the same unmistakable hand. Circleville was transformed. Suspicion bloomed on every street. Neighbors looked at one another differently, wondering who among them was writing the letters. Friendships strained, marriages faltered, and trust evaporated. The anonymous writer had succeeded in creating an atmosphere of paranoia where every glance, every whisper, carried new weight. For Mary and Ron Gillespie, the harassment escalated. Signs appeared along Mary's bus route, taunting her with accusations. She would stop the bus and tear them down, but more would appear the next day. The letters grew bolder, more threatening, demanding not only that she end the alleged affair, but that she confess publicly. Then, in August of 1977, tragedy struck. Ron Gillespie received a phone call that night. One he told family members was from the letter writer. Angry and determined, he grabbed his gun and left the house, telling his children he was going to confront whoever had been tormenting them. Moments later, his truck veered off the road and crashed into a tree. Ron was killed instantly. His gun was found beside him, but investigators noted that one round had been fired. To this day, no one knows at what or at whom Ron fired in those final moments. His death was officially ruled an accident, but many in Circleville believed otherwise. For them, Ron had been silenced, another victim of the letter writer's campaign. Mary tried to continue her life, but the harassment did not stop. The letters kept arriving, taunting her about her husband's death, insisting that her relationship with the school superintendent continued to be exposed. In 1983, the threats took a darker turn. While driving her school bus, Mary spotted a crude sign posted along her route. It accused her teenage daughter of promiscuity, a line that crossed into unbearable cruelty. Furious, Mary stopped the bus, got out, and tore the sign down. But attached to it was something else, a small box, rigged with a string, and what appeared to be a gun. It was a makeshift booby trap, designed to fire when the box was pulled open. The gun had been altered, its serial number filed off, but investigators were able to trace it back to a man named Paul Freshaw. Paul Freshaw was Mary's brother-in-law, married to her sister Karen. He worked at the Anheuser-Busch plant in Columbus, and was by most accounts an ordinary man. When questioned, Paul denied any involvement, but handwriting samples taken from him were compared to the Circleville letters. Experts declared them a match. Paul was arrested, charged, and eventually convicted of attempted murder in connection with the booby trap. He was sentenced to prison, and the town seemed to breathe easier, believing that the watcher of Circleville had finally been unmasked. But then the letters continued. Even while Paul Freshaw sat behind bars, envelopes continued to appear, written in the same blocky style, carrying the same tone of menace. Some were even postmarked from cities far from the prison. Paul himself received a letter in jail, mocking him, insisting he was not the real culprit. This detail unsettled many who had believed his conviction closed the case. If Paul was the writer, how could the letters continue? And if he was not, then who had spent years tormenting the people of Circleville? The Circleville letters did not stop until the mid-1990s, nearly 2 decades after they began. By then they had accused dozens of people, exposed secrets both real and imagined, and left behind a community scarred by suspicion. The case became one of the longest-running mysteries of anonymous harassment in American history. Theories about the letters abound. Some believe Paul Freshaw was indeed the writer, arguing that he may have arranged for others to continue mailing letters on his behalf while in prison. Others point to Karen, his ex-wife, suggesting she may have framed him out of spite during their bitter divorce. Still others believe the letter writer was never identified at all, that the true culprit slipped through the cracks and relished the chaos they created. What makes the Circleville letters so haunting is not just the persistence of the writer, but the impact on the town itself. Circleville was not a place accustomed to mystery or scandal. It was a small Midwestern town, proud of its pumpkin show festival, its football games, its quiet neighborhoods. The letters shattered that peace. They revealed how fragile trust can be, how quickly fear can erode the bonds of community. For Mary Gillespie, the ordeal lasted most of her life. She never confessed to the affair, and Gordon Massey himself denied it, but the accusation hung over her for decades. Her husband's death remained clouded in suspicion, and her family lived under the shadow of the Watcher's words. Paul Freshaw maintained his innocence until his death in 2012, writing letters of his own in which he insisted he had been framed. The truth remains buried in the small-town streets of Circleville, in the mailboxes where hundreds of envelopes once landed, carrying words that burned like fire. Even today, the case attracts researchers, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. The handwriting, with its strange capital letters and blocky form, is instantly recognizable. The sheer persistence of the campaign, lasting almost 20 years, sets it apart from other cases of harassment. And the questions linger: was it one person, or several? Was it a member of Mary's own family, or an outsider with a grudge? Was it someone who enjoyed the power of watching a town unravel under the weight of paranoia? Tonight, as you imagine Circleville, picture the quiet streets of a small Ohio town in the 1970s. Picture children riding bicycles past white-painted houses, neighbors chatting at fences, the air filled with the smell of harvest from nearby fields. Then picture the rustle of an envelope dropped into a mailbox, its words already burning with accusation. Imagine a family opening it, reading the blocky script, feeling their stomachs twist as they realize someone knows things they should not know. And imagine that happening again and again, for years, until trust itself feels impossible. The Circleville letters remain unsolved, their author unknown. They are a reminder that terror does not always need violence to leave scars. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of words on a page, signed by no one, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 whispers. Hi everyone! Welcome back to 1% Crime. I know you can't sleep. So tonight I'll take you to the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California, to a small rural town where one of the state's most disturbing mysteries unfolded. It was the spring of 1981, and in a rustic cabin rented by a single mother, a massacre took place that left investigators stunned. The crime became known as the Keddy Cabin Murders, and even after more than 4 decades, the case remains unsolved. The town of Keddy was small, tucked into Plumas County. Once a bustling railroad stop, by the 1980s it had become quiet. A cluster of cabins in the woods, surrounded by pine trees and mountain air. Families rented the cabins as affordable housing. Life there was simple. Children played outside, neighbors knew each other, and the wilderness pressed close on every side. In late 1980, a woman named Glenna Sue Sharp moved to Keddy with her 5 children. Sue was 36, recently divorced, and determined to start a new life for her family. She had grown up in Springfield, Massachusetts, but after her marriage collapsed, she headed west, looking for stability and a fresh start. She rented Cabin 28, a modest wooden structure with a living room, small bedrooms, and the kind of creaking floors that came with age. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home. Sue was described as quiet but resilient. She worked hard, raising her children alone. John 15, Sheila 14, Tina 12, Ricky 10, and Greg 5. Despite the challenges, she made sure they attended school and tried to give them a sense of normalcy. The kids blended into the rhythms of Keddy, riding bikes, making friends, and spending afternoons outside until the sun dipped behind the mountains. April 11th, 1981 began like any other spring Saturday. That evening, Sue stayed at home in Cabin 28. Her older son, John, had plans to hang out with his friend Dana Wingate, a 17-year-old who often visited. John and Dana went into town earlier that day, hitchhiking as teenagers in rural areas often did back then. They returned to the Sharp cabin late that night, settling in to crash there. Inside the cabin were several people: Sue, the mother, her daughter Tina, age 12, her younger boys Ricky and Greg, and a neighborhood friend named Justin Smart, who was spending the night. Sheila, the 14-year-old, had decided to sleep over at a friend's house down the road, a decision that would save her life. The next morning, April 12th, Sheila returned home. What she found inside Cabin 28 would stay with her forever. As she opened the door, the scene unfolded in silence. The living room was a nightmare. On the floor lay her mother, Sue, along with her brother John and his friend Dana. They had been bound with medical tape and electrical cords, stabbed repeatedly, and beaten with a hammer. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, on the furniture, soaking into the carpet. The violence was overwhelming, far beyond what seemed necessary to kill. And yet, in the bedroom, Ricky, Greg, and Justin were alive. Somehow, the 3 boys had slept through the massacre, untouched. They remembered nothing of the night, though Justin later told conflicting stories about dreams or fragmented memories of intruders. But one family member was missing: 12-year-old Tina. She was gone, nowhere in the cabin, nowhere outside. For 3 years, her disappearance added another layer of terror to the case. Then, in 1984, part of her remains were discovered over 30 miles away, in the woods near Feather Falls. The discovery confirmed what her family already feared: Tina had also been murdered. The investigation into the Keddy murders was massive, But from the beginning, it was plagued with problems. The crime scene was chaotic. Neighbors and volunteers entered the cabin before the area was secured, disturbing evidence. Leads were followed and dropped. Suspects were questioned, but not pursued thoroughly. Some witnesses said they heard muffled screams in the night, but no one called police. One of the most persistent theories centered on neighbors living just next door. Martin Smart, the stepfather of Justin, and his friend Bo Bobby, a drifter with ties to organized crime. Both men were known to law enforcement and were seen as suspicious. Martin's wife later claimed he confessed to her that he killed Sue because she had encouraged his wife to leave him. But the alleged confession was never corroborated. Martin eventually moved away, and Bo died years later, without charges ever being filed. Over the decades, rumors multiplied. Some believed the murders were personal, fueled by rage or jealousy. Others thought it was a random act of violence, or even part of a larger criminal network. The brutality of the crime suggested emotion, a frenzy, not a calculated hit. Yet the sheer scale of it, the abduction of Tina, the survival of the younger boys, raised endless questions. The case went cold. For years, Cabin 28 sat abandoned, its wooden walls still stained with memories of that night. The story became a local legend whispered among teenagers, investigated by amateur sleuths, written about in magazines and books. In 2004, the cabin was demolished, erasing the physical structure but not the mystery. In the 2010 renewed interest in the case brought forward new evidence. Investigators re-examined old files, tested DNA with modern technology, and uncovered overlooked connections. A hammer matching the suspected murder weapon was found in a nearby pond. Letters surfaced, written by Martin Smart, in which he seemed to express guilt. Police confirmed that DNA evidence from the scene pointed toward known suspects, though names were not released. Even so, no arrests were made. The killer or killers remains officially unidentified. The Keddy cabin murders remain haunting because they combine intimacy with horror. This wasn't a random street killing or a robbery gone wrong. It was a family home, a safe place turned into a slaughterhouse. Children were spared while others were massacred. A girl was taken away into the night, her fate unknown for years, and the suspects lived just a few steps away, close enough to hear the screams. Tonight, as you imagine Cabin 28, picture the quiet Sierra Nevada forest pressing close, the cold air heavy with pine. Picture the Sharp family gathered inside, a mother and her children trying to rebuild their lives in a new place. And then picture the silence of early morning, broken only by Sheila opening the door and seeing what no child should ever see. The Keddy cabin murders are remembered not only for their brutality, but also for the questions left unanswered. Who killed Sue, John, Dana, and Tina? Why were the younger boys left alive? Why was Tina taken? Was it rage, revenge, or something darker? To this day, no one knows. Story 2. The Cleveland Strangler. Anthony Sowell, 2007, 2009, Ohio, USA. Cleveland, Ohio, a crumbling neighborhood on Imperial Avenue, where a quiet house concealed one of the most disturbing discoveries in American history. Between 2007 and 2009, women disappeared from the streets of Cleveland. Many were last seen walking near the home of a man named Anthony Sowell. For 2 years, no one imagined what was happening behind his doors. When the truth came out, it horrified even the most experienced investigators. This is the story of the Cleveland Strangler. Cleveland in the 2000s was a city struggling with poverty and decline. Once a thriving industrial hub, Parts of the city had been hollowed out by job loss and economic hardship. In some neighborhoods, houses sat abandoned, their windows broken, weeds growing through porches. Drugs were a constant presence. Crack cocaine had ravaged communities in the 1990s and left scars that lingered. For women living on the margins, those battling addiction, homelessness, or abuse, the streets were dangerous. Disappearances were sometimes dismissed as the chaos of hard lives, not as signs of something darker. Anthony Sowell lived in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, in a 3-story house on Imperial Avenue. Born in 1959, Sowell had grown up in Cleveland in a strict, abusive household. His early life was marked by violence and trauma, but as an adult he appeared quiet, even unremarkable. He had served in the U.S. Marine Corps and received an honorable discharge. Later, he spent 15 years in prison for attempted rape. After his release in 2005, he returned to Cleveland, living in the house he inherited from his late stepmother. To neighbors he seemed odd but not immediately threatening. He was seen walking with women, sometimes offering them drinks. He kept to himself. Few could have imagined what was happening inside. Between 2007 and 2009, women in the neighborhood began vanishing. Many were vulnerable, struggling with addiction, living in poverty, or estranged from their families. Police reports were filed, but with little evidence, cases went cold. Some officers assumed the women had drifted away or disappeared into the city's underworld. Their absences did not make headlines, but inside the house on Imperial Avenue, Anthony Sowell was hiding their fate. It all unraveled in October 2009 when police came to his home to investigate a new sexual assault complaint. A woman had escaped from Sowell's house and reported that he had attacked her. With a warrant in hand, officers entered the property. What they found would shock them, and the entire city. The first thing they noticed was the smell. For months neighbors had complained about a foul odor drifting from the house. Some thought it was rotting meat from a nearby sausage shop. Others assumed it was dead animals. But as officers moved through the rooms, they discovered the true source: bodies. The remains of women were hidden throughout the property. Some were buried in shallow graves in the backyard. Others were wrapped in plastic and stashed in the basement, attic, or crawl spaces. The stench of decomposition had seeped into the walls. By the time the search was complete, the remains of 11 women were recovered. The victims ranged in age from their 20s to their 50s. Most had lived hard lives, struggling with addiction or poverty, but they were daughters, sisters, mothers. Their disappearances had gone unnoticed by the wider world, but in Sowell's house they had all met the same fate. Each had been lured with the promise of alcohol or drugs, attacked and murdered. The horror of the discovery sent shockwaves through Cleveland. How could so many women vanish from the same neighborhood without anyone connecting the dots? Families who had filed missing persons reports were devastated to learn their loved ones had been inside that house all along. Vigils were held. Community leaders demanded answers. Anthony Sowell was arrested and charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. His trial began in 2011, drawing national attention. The prosecution presented chilling evidence: DNA linking him to the victims, testimony from women who had survived assaults, and the horrifying conditions of the house itself. Survivors described being lured inside, choked until they passed out, and waking up to find Sowell looming over them. Some managed to escape. Others did not. The defense argued that Sowell had been shaped by a brutal upbringing, but the jury was unmoved. In 2011, he was convicted on 82 counts and sentenced to death. He was sent to death row in Ohio, where he remained until his death in 2021 from a terminal illness. The case left behind painful questions. not only about Sowell, but about the society that allowed his crimes to go unnoticed for so long. Why were the disappearances of these women not taken seriously? Why did police dismiss early reports of the smell and the missing persons? Many argued that the victims' social status played a role. They were poor, marginalized, often battling addiction. Their lives mattered less to the system, and in that indifference, Sowell found freedom to kill. The house on Imperial Avenue was eventually demolished, but its memory lingers. The empty lot became a place of mourning, covered in flowers, crosses, and handwritten notes. Families of the victims still gather there to remember. The story of the Cleveland Strangler is not just about Anthony Sowell. It is about 11 women whose lives were taken, and about the families who fought to be heard. It is also about how societies can fail the vulnerable, allowing predators to thrive in silence. Tonight, as you imagine Cleveland in 2009, picture the rows of aging houses, the cracked sidewalks, the flicker of street lamps. Picture the quiet facade of 12205 Imperial Avenue, an ordinary house hiding an unimaginable horror. Think of the neighbors who wrinkled their noses at the smell, but never guessed the truth, of the families who searched for loved ones while their remains lay hidden just blocks away. Anthony Sowell is gone, but the shadow of what he did remains. His crimes remind us how cruelty can thrive in neglect, how silence can be deadly, and how every missing person deserves to be searched for, no matter their circumstances. Story 3. The West Mesa Bone Collector, 2009, Albuquerque, USA. Desert of New Mexico, where in 2009 a dog uncovered something that would become one of America's most chilling mysteries. On the dry, dusty mesa outside Albuquerque, shallow graves were discovered. In them were the remains of 11 women. The case became known as the mystery of the West Mesa Bone Collector, and to this day, the killer has never been identified. Albuquerque in the early 2000s was a city of contrasts. Against the backdrop of the Sandia Mountains, adobe houses lined neighborhoods, and Route 66 cut straight through town, carrying the echo of its old reputation. But beyond the city limits, the land opened into wide stretches of desert, scrub, sagebrush, and endless sand under a sky that seemed too big to contain. It was here in these empty expanses that someone carried out a quiet campaign of murder. The story begins in February 2009. A woman was walking her dog along the West Mesa, a dry plateau on the city's edge where new housing developments had stalled because of the economy. The dog began digging and unearthed what looked like a human bone. Alarmed, the woman contacted authorities. When police arrived, they quickly realized they were looking at more than just one skeleton. Excavations began, and soon the desert gave up its secrets. One by one, shallow graves were uncovered, spread across a 92-acre stretch of sand and scrub. In total, the remains of 11 women and one unborn child were found. The women had all disappeared between 2001 and 2005. Their families had filed missing person reports, but in many cases the women were dismissed by authorities as runaways, addicts, or sex workers. On the mesa, their fates were revealed. The victims were young, most in their 20s, some still in their teens. Many were Hispanic, some were Native American. Several had been mothers, leaving behind children. Their lives had been marked by hardship, addiction, and vulnerability. But they were people with families who loved them, and their disappearance had left holes in their communities. The discovery of their bodies was devastating, but for their families, it was at least an answer after years of silence. The media dubbed the killer the West Mesa Bone Collector, a name that captured both the horror of the discovery and the mystery of the person who had orchestrated it. Investigators faced a monumental challenge. The desert had erased much of the evidence. Time and weather had stripped the bodies down to bone, leaving few clues about how the women had been killed. Forensic experts combed the site for fragments, fibers, and DNA, but the desert had swallowed nearly everything. Still, some patterns emerged. The women had all been buried in similar shallow graves, suggesting the same perpetrator. The timeline placed their disappearances during the early 2000s, when Albuquerque was grappling with waves of violence tied to drugs and prostitution. The killer seemed to have targeted vulnerable women, lured them away, and disposed of them far from prying eyes. Story 4. The Isdal Woman, 1970, Norway. The quiet valley in Norway. In the late autumn of 1970, hikers stumbled upon the burned body of a woman in a remote place called Isdalen, the Ice Valley. What they found sparked one of the strangest investigations in Norwegian history. A woman with no clear identity, multiple disguises, coded notes, and a trail that stretched across Europe. To this day, no one knows who she really was. She is remembered only as the Isdal Woman. The discovery happened on November 29th, 1970. A man was hiking with his 2 young daughters in the foothills near Bergen, a city on Norway's western coast. The area was known as Death Valley by locals because of previous suicides and hiking accidents. As they walked along a narrow path, the father smelled something acrid in the air, burnt chemical, not the scent of wood smoke. Following the odor, they came across a horrifying sight: the charred body of a woman lying among rocks, her arms curled up as if shielding her face. The police were called immediately. Investigators arrived and examined the scene. Around the woman's body were strange items: bottles of water, a half-empty bottle of alcohol, a burned plastic container, and fragments of clothing. Nearby were pieces of jewelry, rings, a watch, but oddly, they had been placed carefully beside her body rather than worn. A burned passport was found, but it had no name. The scene looked staged, as though someone had arranged the details to tell or hide a story. The autopsy revealed that the woman had died from a combination of smoke inhalation and burns, but she had also ingested a large number of sleeping pills. Her fingerprints had been sanded down, making identification almost impossible. The search for her identity began. Police checked hotels in Bergen and discovered that in the weeks before her death, the woman had stayed in several different places under a series of false names. In each hotel she gave a different nationality, sometimes Belgian, sometimes French, sometimes German. She had a collection of wigs and stylish clothes, and she spoke multiple languages: French, German, Dutch, and broken English. Guests remembered her as aloof, mysterious, and always alone. Among her belongings were strange coded notes, strings of letters and numbers. When police cracked the code, they realized they were records of her travels, dates and places she had visited. The notes showed she had moved across Europe: Paris, Hamburg, Basel, and smaller towns in Norway. It was as though she had been tracing a hidden map, following instructions that no one else could see. Speculation grew quickly. Was she a spy during the Cold War? Bergen was near a naval base that tested advanced missile technology. Had she been gathering information? Some investigators believed so. The wigs, the false passports, the coded notes, they all fit the profile of espionage. But if she was a spy, who did she work for? The Soviet Union? NATO? Another intelligence agency? No country ever admitted to knowing her. Others thought she might have been involved in criminal activity, smuggling, forgery, or the black market. Her lifestyle, moving constantly under different identities, fit that possibility. as well, but there was no proof. As weeks turned into months, police grew desperate. They released composite sketches of her face, hoping someone would recognize her. A few witnesses came forward. One man recalled meeting her on a train, describing her as elegant with dark hair and striking eyes. Another said she had told him she was from South Africa, but none of the leads panned out. Eventually, with no identity and no family stepping forward, the authorities buried her in a simple grave in Bergen. The headstone bore no name, only the date of burial and a cross. Local officials placed a small plaque that read, "Here lies a woman found dead in Isdalen, the 29th of November 1970. Her identity is unknown." But the mystery did not fade. Over the years, journalists and amateur investigators kept digging. In the 1990s, the case resurfaced in the press, sparking new theories. In 2016, Norwegian police reopened the case with modern technology. They re-examined her teeth and bones, discovering through isotope analysis that she likely grew up in Central or Eastern Europe, perhaps around the German-Czech border. That narrowed the field, but not enough to find her name. DNA testing revealed she was European, not South African as some witnesses had claimed. Yet even with these modern tools, no match has ever been found. Her DNA does not appear in any public database, meaning no known family has come forward or been identified. Theories continue to swell. Some are convinced she was a Cold War spy, killed by rivals or silenced by her own employers. Others think she may have taken her own life, carefully staging her final days in a way that would keep her true identity hidden forever. A few wonder if she was the victim of a more personal crime, murdered by someone she trusted, who tried to erase her existence. What lingers is the image of a woman who moved through Europe under borrowed names, carrying wigs and coded notes, slipping in and out of hotels like a ghost. A woman whose last journey ended in a remote Norwegian valley, her body burned, her fingerprints erased, her secrets intact. The grave of the Isdal woman still stands in Bergen. People sometimes leave flowers, small tributes to a life that remains untold. For Norwegians, the case is not just a mystery. It is a reminder of how, even in a modern world, a person can vanish into silence, leaving behind only fragments and questions. Tonight, as you picture Norway in 1970, imagine the sharp cold of late November, the grey sky hanging low over the mountains. Imagine the quiet of Isdalen, broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the acrid smell of smoke lingering in the air. Imagine the strange stillness of a body surrounded by carefully arranged belongings, as if someone wanted the scene to tell a story but never gave the ending. The Isdal woman remains unnamed, her life unwritten, her fate unsolved. Perhaps she was a spy, perhaps a fugitive, perhaps simply a woman running from something she could never escape. We may never know, but her mystery continues to haunt, like the echo of footsteps in a cold Norwegian valley. The investigation cast suspicion on several possible suspects. One name was Lorenzo Montoya, a man with a history of violence against women. He lived not far from the West Mesa. In December 2006, he was killed by the boyfriend of a woman he had strangled during a date. Police later discovered Montoya had ties to sex workers in the area, and the timing of his death coincided with when the disappearances stopped. Some investigators believe strongly that Montoya was the bone collector, though no definitive evidence ever proved it. Another line of investigation pointed toward organized crime. Some believed the murders were tied to trafficking or gang activity, that the women had been killed as part of a wider operation and buried in the desert as if their lives meant nothing. Others wondered if the killings were the work of a serial predator, someone who hunted women for sport. Despite years of work, no charges have ever been filed. The families of the victims continue to grieve, holding vigils on the mesa each year. The site has become a memorial, a place where crosses mark the names of the women and where flowers are left to honor them. The case remains haunting not only because it is unsolved, but because it speaks to a broader tragedy. Many of the victims were women on the margins of society, and their disappearances were not treated with urgency. Their families say police often dismissed their fears, assuming the women had simply left town. Only when the bodies surfaced did the scope of the crime become undeniable. The desert, with its silence and vastness, became both a grave and a witness. People say the land remembers, even if it cannot speak. On the West Mesa, the wind still blows through sage and yucca, carrying with it the memory of 11 women whose lives were cut short. The West Mesa bone collector may never be caught. Perhaps he died with his secret, like Lorenzo Montoya. Perhaps he still walks free, blending into ordinary life, carrying the memory of what he buried in the sand. For the families, the hope of justice remains alive, but with each passing year, the answers feel further away. Tonight, as you picture Albuquerque, imagine the city lights fading into desert darkness, the mesa stretching wide under a full moon. Picture the crosses that now stand there, each with a name, each marking a life that mattered. And think of the silence, the way the land holds secrets long after people are gone. The story of the West Mesa bone collector is not just about death, it is about how society values, or fails to value, its most vulnerable members. It is about women whose lives should have been protected, not forgotten. And it is about the enduring mystery of a killer who used the desert as his accomplice, leaving behind bones as his only trace. Story 5. The Murder of Meredith Kircher, 2007, Perugia, Italy. The medieval hillside city in Italy, a place of cobblestones and stone archways, where students filled narrow streets with laughter and music. In 2007, that quiet city became the center of a global media storm when a young British student named Meredith Kircher was murdered in her home. What followed was not only a brutal crime, but years of trials, overturned convictions, and headlines that blurred truth with spectacle. This is the story of the murder of Meredith Kircher. Perugia is an ancient city, perched on a hilltop in Umbria, Italy. By day, sunlight warms its terracotta rooftops and medieval towers. By night, students gather in piazzas, their voices carrying up stone alleys. In 2007, Perugia was home to thousands of university students, both Italian and international, drawn to its historic charm and affordable lifestyle. Among them was Meredith Kircher, a 21-year-old exchange student from Leeds, England. Meredith, or Mez to her friends, had arrived in Perugia in September. She was studying European politics and Italian, and her friends described her as warm, kind, and responsible. She shared a villa-style house with several other women, including Amanda Knox, a 20-year-old student from Seattle, Washington. The two were not close friends but housemates, part of a circle of young people experiencing life abroad. On November 1st, 2007, Perugia celebrated a public holiday, All Saints' Day. Many students went out that evening, filling bars and restaurants. Meredith spent part of the night with friends, returning home around 9 p.m. The next morning, her body was discovered in her bedroom. The scene shocked even seasoned investigators. Meredith had been brutally attacked. She had multiple stab wounds and evidence of sexual assault. Her room showed signs of a struggle, with belongings scattered and blood on the floor. The rest of the house, however, was oddly staged. A window was broken, as though someone had forced entry, but police quickly suspected the break-in had been faked. In the middle of the chaos, another suspect emerged. DNA evidence at the scene pointed to Rudy Guede, a 20-year-old man from Ivory Coast who lived in Perugia. Guede admitted being in the house that night, but claimed he had gone to the bathroom and returned to find Meredith attacked by someone else. His DNA was found on Meredith and in the room, making him a central figure in the case. The trials that followed became a circus. In 2008, Guede was convicted of Meredith's murder in a fast-track trial and sentenced to 30 years, later reduced to 16 on appeal. But prosecutors insisted Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito were also involved, arguing the crime was committed by 3 people together. Their theory was sensational: a violent, drug-fueled sex game gone wrong. It fit the headlines, but the evidence was thin. Knox and Solicito were convicted in 2009. Knox received a 26-year sentence, Solicito 25. But the verdict sparked outrage internationally. Many argued the evidence was circumstantial, the DNA testing flawed, and the prosecution's story inconsistent. For years the case bounced through appeals. In 2011, their convictions were overturned and they were released. In 2013, Italy's highest court reinstated the convictions, only to definitively acquit them in 2015, citing stunning errors in the investigation. Through it all, Meredith's family watched as their daughter's death became overshadowed by tabloid frenzy. The British press focused on Knox, turning her into a character in a morality play. The American press defended her as a victim of Italian injustice. Lost in the noise was Meredith herself, her life, her kindness, her laughter. The case revealed cracks in how justice and media intertwine. Investigators seemed determined to force the facts into a dramatic story, even when evidence did not support it. The press fueled public opinion, turning the trial into entertainment. Amanda Knox became a household name, while Meredith Kercher was too often reduced to a backdrop. Yet the core tragedy remained. Meredith was a young woman abroad, living her dream, cut down violently in her own home. Her parents described her as intelligent, funny, and caring, with a bright future ahead. For them, the circus of trials was a second cruelty. Today the consensus is that Rudy Guede acted alone, though questions remain. Why were Knox and Solicito ever implicated so forcefully? Was it incompetence, cultural misunderstanding, or the law of a sensational narrative? Whatever the reason, the years of trials left scars on everyone involved. Perugia has moved on, but the villa where Meredith was killed is still remembered as the house of tragedy. Tourists who pass through the city sometimes ask about it, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, unaware of how deeply the case affected Italy and beyond. The murder of Meredith Kercher is a reminder of how justice can go astray, how media can distort, and how a single life lost can ripple across nations. It also reminds us to remember the victim, not just the scandal. Meredith's story deserves to be told not only through the lens of trials and controversy, but through the memory of who she was. Tonight, as you picture Perugia, imagine the narrow alleys winding uphill, the glow of lanterns on old stone walls, the sound of laughter spilling from student bars. Imagine a small villa at the edge of town, filled with the ordinary clutter of student life. Books, clothes, laughter, plans for the next day. And then imagine the silence that fell when Meredith's voice was taken from it. Her story endures not only as a legal case, but as a loss, a daughter, a sister, a friend. And like so many true crime stories, it leaves us with questions that may never be fully answered. Story 6. The Long Island serial killer, also known as the Gilgo Beach Killer USA. The The windswept coastline of Long Island, New York, where ocean waves crash endlessly against the sand, and where, beneath the dunes, investigators uncovered one of the largest crime scenes in American history. Between the late 1990s and the 2010s, bodies appeared along a lonely highway, hidden under brush, discarded in burlap, left as if the killer believed no one would ever come looking. For years, the case was known only as the Gilgo Beach murders. The killer was called the Long Island serial killer, and for more than a decade, he seemed to vanish into the very community he terrorized. Long Island, stretching out from New York City like a great arm into the Atlantic, has always been a place of contrasts. There are wealthy enclaves like the Hamptons, where glittering mansions rise over the ocean. There are quiet suburban neighborhoods filled with commuters who take the train into Manhattan every morning. And then there are stretches of marshland and dunes, where the wind whistles through beach grass and the sea spray carries a salty chill. It was here, along Ocean Parkway, a ribbon of road running parallel to the shoreline, that the killer chose to hide his victims. The story begins, at least in the public eye. In December of 2010, a young woman named Shannon Gilbert vanished after visiting a client in Oak Beach, a small gated community near Gilgo Beach. Shannon was 24 years old, working as an escort who advertised online. On the night of May 1st, 2010, she became panicked during a date and fled into the neighborhood, knocking on doors, calling for help. At 4:51 a.m., she placed a frantic 911 call, telling dispatchers that someone was after her. For 23 minutes, her voice carried desperation and terror. Then the line went dead. Despite a search, Shannon was never found. It was during the hunt for Shannon that police stumbled upon something even more horrifying. On December 11th, 2010, a K-9 officer named John Mallier was searching near Gilgo Beach with his German Shepherd, Blue. The dog caught a scent and led officers into the brush beside Ocean Parkway. There, wrapped in burlap, they discovered human remains. Shock rippled through the search team. As they expanded their sweep, more bodies emerged. Within days, 4 women had been found. They were all young, all sex workers, all missing for years. The press called them the Gilgo Four. Maureen Brainard Barnes, 25 years old, disappeared in July 2007. Melissa Barthélemy, 24, disappeared in July 2009. Megan Waterman, 22, disappeared in June 2010. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, disappeared in September 2010. Each woman had lived a precarious life, balancing love for their families with struggles of addiction, poverty, or violence. They had all advertised escort services on Craigslist. Their disappearances had been noticed by family members, but had drawn little police or media attention. Only when their bodies were discovered together did the world begin to understand that something much larger was unfolding. The discovery transformed Gilgo Beach into a crime scene. Dozens of police combed the sand. Cadaver dogs searched the dunes, helicopters buzzed overhead, and the more they looked, the more they found. In March and April of 2011, 6 additional sets of remains were discovered. Some were only partial skeletons. Some belonged to women whose torsos had been found years earlier in other parts of New York. One set of remains belonged to a toddler girl, another to a young Asian or transgender woman, still unidentified. In all, at least 11 victims were linked to the Long Island serial killer investigation. The timeline stretched back to the late 1990s. For more than a decade, someone had been luring women away from their lives, killing them, and discarding them like garbage on the edge of one of the busiest cities in the world. The investigation was massive, involving Suffolk County Police, New York State Police, the FBI, and countless local officers. Yet the case quickly grew cold. The sheer passage of time had eroded evidence. Bodies were skeletonized, DNA degraded, phone records were elusive, burner phones left only faint trails. Witnesses gave fragments of sightings, but nothing solid, and hanging over it all was the fact that the victims were sex workers, people society often ignores until it's too late. Their disappearances had not triggered urgency until the bodies were found. Theories multiplied. Some believed there was not one killer, but several, perhaps using the same dumping grounds. Others speculated about police involvement, noting corruption scandals in Suffolk County law enforcement. Still, others whispered that the killer might be a local man who blended in perfectly. Someone with a job, a family, a life that looked ordinary on the surface. The case haunted Long Island. Families of the victims held vigils by the beach, candles flickering in the cold Atlantic wind. They spoke their daughters' names, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, Amber, so the world would remember them as people, not just bones in burlap. For years the case stagnated. Then in the 2020s, new energy arrived, advances in DNA technology, digital forensics and cell phone analysis began to close the net. Investigators revisited old phone records, tracing the burner phones the killer had used to contact the women. They linked the geography of the calls to a man named Rex Hoseman, a 59-year-old architect living in Massapequa Park, just miles from Gilgo Beach. Hoseman was not what most people imagined when they thought of a serial killer. He was a father of two, married, with a steady job running a Manhattan firm. He commuted into the city daily, wore suits, and seemed entirely normal. But investigators say he lived a double life. His DNA was found on one of the victims. Hair belonging to his wife, who had been out of town during several of the murders, was found on others. His internet searches revealed dark obsessions with sex workers, torture, and violent pornography. He had allegedly used burner phones to arrange meetings and taunt families. In July 2023, Hoseman was arrested and charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo 4. He remains the prime suspect in others. The arrest shook the community. Neighbors described him as an odd but harmless man. To his clients, he was just an architect. Yet prosecutors painted him as a predator who had hidden in plain sight for decades. And still, the mystery is not solved. Was Hoseman responsible for all 11 victims, or just some, who killed the toddler found in the dunes? What happened to Shannon Gilbert, whose disappearance had started the search in the first place? Officially, her death is still listed as accidental drowning, but her family believes otherwise. The Gilgo Beach case is haunting because it shows how violence can live beside ordinary life. These murders did not happen in a far-off wilderness. They happened in the shadow of suburbia, along a road driven daily by commuters, hidden by nothing more than sand and brush. Tonight, as you imagine Long Island, picture the dark highway stretching east, the dunes rising like waves of sand, the Atlantic wind rattling the beach grass. Picture detectives with flashlights combing the brush, their boots sinking into damp earth, uncovering burlap sacks that tell the story of lives cut short. Picture the families waiting for phone calls that never came, then learning years later that their daughters had been there all along, in the dunes by the ocean. The Long Island serial killer is a case of brutality, but also of silence from institutions that overlooked the vulnerable. Silence from neighbors who noticed strange things but never spoke up. Silence from the dunes themselves as they covered the bones. Perhaps now, with an arrest, answers will finally come. But even if they do, nothing can return the lives that were taken, or erase the years of not knowing. Story 7. The Dupont de Ligonnès family murders 2011, Nantes, France. France, the city of Nantes, where in 2011 an entire family was found buried beneath the patio of their home. At first glance, the case seemed straightforward. The father was missing, the mother and 4 children dead. But as investigators dug deeper, the story grew stranger. Who was Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, and where did he go after murdering his family? More than a decade later, the questions still remain. Nantes is a city in western France, sitting on the Loire River. It's a place of history and elegance, with stone cathedrals, cobbled streets, and bustling neighborhoods. Among them was an affluent district where the Dupont de Ligonnès family lived. Their house was 3 stories, with a white facade and a small patio out back. To neighbors, they seemed like an ordinary upper-middle-class family, but inside, things were unraveling. The Dupont de Ligonnès family consisted of Xavier, 50 years old, his wife Agnès, 48, and their 4 children, Arthur, 20, Thomas, 18, Anne, 16, and Benoit, just 13. They also had 2 dogs. Xavier came from an aristocratic family with old ties to nobility, though he had no real fortune of his own. He was charming, educated, and religious, but his business ventures consistently failed. By 2011, he was deeply in debt, trying to maintain an image of wealth and success that had long since collapsed. Neighbors saw the family as quiet, devout Catholics. The children attended private schools, and Agnès worked part-time as an assistant in a Catholic school. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Agnès confided to friends that her marriage was strained. Xavier had become withdrawn, brooding over financial ruin and his role as provider. In early April 2011, strange things began happening. The children's schools received letters saying the family was moving suddenly to Australia due to Xavier's new job in the US Drug Enforcement Administration, an odd claim since Xavier had no such career. Friends received similar letters, typed and signed, explaining that the family was entering a witness protection program and could not be contacted. Even Agnès's workplace received a resignation notice. To outsiders, it looked like a family making a sudden secret move. But neighbors soon grew suspicious. The shutters of the house remained closed, the mailbox filled with letters. The family's cars stayed in the driveway. Days passed, then weeks, with no sign of life inside the house. On April 21st, police entered to conduct a search. At first, the house looked undisturbed. Beds neatly made, furniture in place. But as they stepped into the garden and began examining the patio, they noticed freshly disturbed soil. Beneath the gravel, wrapped carefully in sheets and plastic bags, were bodies. The remains of Agnès and the 4 children were found, each shot with a .22 caliber rifle. The family's 2 dogs were buried alongside them. The bodies had been covered with quicklime, an attempt to speed decomposition. Xavier, the father, was missing. An international manhunt began almost immediately. Police traced Xavier's movements in the days after the murders. He had stayed in hotels across southern France, using his credit card to pay for meals and rooms. Surveillance cameras captured him withdrawing money and carrying a large bag. On April 15th, he was seen leaving a small hotel in the Var region near the French Riviera. He walked out calmly, carrying his bag. After that, he was never seen again. The murders shocked France. The idea that a respected father from a noble family could execute his wife and 4 children was unthinkable. But investigators found evidence that Xavier had planned the killings for weeks. He had purchased quicklime, ordered a silencer for his rifle, and researched methods of disposing of bodies. Financial records showed him drowning in debt. Some speculated he saw murder as a twisted way of sparing his family from shame. But why flee afterward? If his plan was to end their lives to save them from disgrace, why didn't he take his own? That unanswered question fed the mystery. Over the years, sightings of Xavier have been reported across the world. Some claimed he was seen in southern France, others in South America, even in Thailand. None were confirmed. In 2015, police raided a monastery in the Alps after a tip suggested he had taken refuge there. In 2019, a man was arrested in Glasgow, Scotland, believed at first to be Xavier, but fingerprint analysis proved otherwise. Theories abound. Some believe Xavier is dead, perhaps having taken his life in the wilderness of southern France after the murders. Others think he escaped and built a new identity abroad, living quietly with the knowledge of what he did. His aristocratic connections, they argue, may have helped him vanish. What remains are the victims: Agnes, Arthur, Thomas, Anne, and Benoit. Their lives were cut short in an act of betrayal by the person meant to protect them. The family is buried together in Nantes, their graves visited by mourners who still struggle to understand what happened inside that house. The case continues to fascinate because it combines horror with mystery. It is both a family tragedy and an international fugitive hunt. It asks how well we really know the people closest to us, and how someone can vanish in the modern world despite surveillance, passports, and databases. Tonight, as you picture Nantes, imagine the quiet streets of a French neighborhood, shutters drawn, the air heavy with spring rain. Picture the house at 55 Boulevard, Robert Schumann, its white walls concealing silence. Picture investigators kneeling on the patio, pulling back gravel and soil to reveal what no one wanted to see. And then picture a man walking calmly out of a hotel days later, carrying his bag, stepping into the sunlight, and vanishing forever. The Dupont de Ligonnès murders remain unsolved, not because we don't know who committed them, but because we don't know what became of him. Somewhere perhaps Xavier still lives, or perhaps his bones lie hidden in the French countryside, his secret taken to the grave. Thank you for staying with me tonight. If you're still awake, let me know where you're listening from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you won't miss the next case. For now, good night, and stay safe.